and welcome to Synergia Forum number 81, the 17th in our series of virtual forums. And the topic we're going to address and discuss today is something that can make or break industries and, dare I say, economies as well. Supply chains and the 7 core resilience capabilities. And as always, at the Synergia Foundation, we have the finest minds in the world from both industry and academia to discuss this subject, starting with Jim Rice, Deputy Director, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you so much, Mr. Rice, for joining us here at the Synergia Foundation.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we have from India, Janat Shah, Director of IIM Udaipur, one of the finest minds again in the country on the subject. Thank you, Mr. Shah.
Glad to be here.
Right. And from the industry, we have Udayant Malhotra. Well, the CEO and Managing Director of Dynamatics, a dynamic young man who's redefined the way supplies are made to the aerospace industry. Thank you so much, Udayant, for being here.
It's a pleasure indeed. Thank you.
And we have as special guest this evening to add on to the main panel who will be discussing the subject, industry perspectives from Kishore Jayaraman, President, Rolls-Royce India and South Asia. Thank you so much, Mr. Jayaraman, for joining us. R.S. Subramanian, Senior Vice President and Managing Director, DHL India. Both of you, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we have, of course, our own in-house expert on supply chains, Toby Simon, President and Founder, Synergia Foundation, who makes all this possible. Thank you so much, Toby, for joining us. Well, before I open the floor to Mr. Jim Rice to make his opening remarks, let me just run all our audience and the panelists through the format that we will be following this evening. Given the complexity and the technical nature of the topic, we didn't want to limit our panelists' thoughts with time limitations. So Mr. Jim Rice will make his opening remarks, followed by Mr. Janat Shah, and then Udayant Malhotra, and then, of course, special interventions from our special guests, Mr. Jayaraman and Subramaniam. And then we will have question and answer session from questions from the audience that may come in at this stage, and also experts that may make their observations on questions on the discussion. So without any further delay, Mr. Rice, please start with your prescription and suggestions and analysis of the supply chains and 7 core resilience capabilities.
Well, first, let me ask a question of the audience and of our esteemed guests and say, do you want to be a hero? That's the question at hand. Do you want to be a hero? I see that there are hands, a few hands showing. And what I like to do is to, let's see here, is, so I'll talk a little bit about how one might address that question. Many of you have had to close your operations and make very difficult decisions. And your decisions are affecting human beings, affecting their livelihood, their families. And it's not unusual to feel helpless in a situation like that. And you might wonder, what could you have done differently? Well, I want to spend just a few moments here. I'll talk for about 9 minutes and tell you that I think it's possible to prepare so that the next time you can be a hero. What I'd like to start with, though, before I continue with my remarks, is to say a thank you to my colleague, Toby Simon, for inviting me to join. It's been a very long relationship that I've had with Toby. I had twisted his arm to become a research affiliate with us some years ago at the MIT Center for Transportation Logistics, and I've always appreciated the work that Toby has done, both being a practitioner and a leader, a thought leader. And so it's a pleasure and a real privilege for me to be here with you all. What's on our mind right now, of course, though, is risk management, and that's driven because of the COVID pandemic. And it leads us to ask the question, how can we manage these challenges? And I would argue that most people, when we think about something like COVID, a disruption, we think about risk events, and risk events are unlimited. We can think about risk events in terms of risks that may be financial risks or strategic risks or operational risks. They come in the size and shapes of disruptions that look like terrorist attacks, or they could be financial meltdowns. They could be an explosion at a port that we've just seen in Beirut. They could be a volcano. It could be a labor action. There's no end to the number of different ways that your supply chains can be affected. And the question I would ask is, can your organization mitigate every source of risk? And I think that if you're going to be honest, the answer is no, you cannot mitigate every source of risk. The good news, though, is that while the number of sources of risk are unlimited, the outcomes of risk events are not unlimited. And let me just pose a few questions for you and ask you to consider. Think about these disruptions. Imagine a typhoon that destroys your supplier's factory, or a pandemic like the one we're dealing with that prevents your supplier from operating, or a labor action at your supplier that halts their production, or a local government that closes all the plants for environmental reasons, like we saw in the run-up to the Olympics in Beijing. These identify many, many different sources of risk, but there's only one outcome to every one of those particular disruptions, and that is the loss of the capacity to acquire materials for some period of time. Think about these disruptions. An explosion destroys the local port, again, like we saw in Beirut. An earthquake takes down several bridges and highways, or a volcano spews ash, making air travel impossible, which we saw in Europe a number of years ago. Again, multiple sources of risk, but only one outcome, and that one outcome was the loss of the capacity to transport, to ship for some period of time. Now, these two examples try to illustrate that while there are many, many different sources of risks, these many different sources of risk often boil down to one or to a limited number of outcomes. And my argument is that all disruptions result in a loss of only one or more of the following capacities. And that is the capacity to acquire materials, that's getting supply, the capacity to move products, to ship or transport it, the capacity to communicate, the capacity to convert, that means your own internal operations, the capacity to have human resources, that personnel of having personnel available, and then the capacity of financial flows. You need funds to operate. And then lastly, the capacity to distribute to customers and consumers. Now, in our past work, we've referred to these as failure modes. But if we turn them around and think about, if you have those capabilities, these indeed are the core capabilities that you must have to have a resilient supply chain. And again, that's the capacity for supply, to transport, to communicate, to convert, run your own operations, for human resources, financial flows, and to distribute. Now, this sounds simple, but it's not entirely so. But it is simpler than trying to create plans for every different kind of risk. Now, in dealing with this and setting up and making plans for that, those in the business continuity planning community or the risk management community, this will not come as any surprise. In fact, this is what business continuity planners do. They make continuity plans to be able to maintain these capabilities. But we don't often think about them as these 7 core capabilities. We might think of one, we might think of 2. But there are problems and challenges that exist. We have to decide how you're going to do that. Are you going to use flexibility, or are you going to use redundancy? And you have to decide, well, how much resilience do you really need? Do you need 100% capacity to expand, or half of that? And for how long? 1 week, 3 weeks? As we've seen in COVID, this challenge has lasted at least 12 weeks with the long tail after that. And then finally, the big question is, how much are you going to invest? And how are you going to decide how much you're going to invest? These are some of the challenges I think that come before us. And when we think about the current pandemic and we compare it to other disruptions, it's quite distinct in the following sense, that we have seen the loss of more of these capabilities, more of these capacities than in any other disruption that we've experienced. If you look at the global financial crisis, the primary constraint there, the primary loss of capacity was in the financial domain. If you look at the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the primary loss of capacity there was in supply. If you think about the Hurricane Katrina that affected in the United States in 2005, this was largely a regional impact across most all of those particular capabilities, those capacities. You think about the Sendai disaster of 2011, the primary loss of capacity was in supply. There was some loss of transportation on a local basis. There was some loss of internal operations on a local basis. There was some loss of human resources on a local basis, but not a global, only global in terms of supply. But if we think about COVID, was a major loss of transportation, because companies aren't allowed to move things. You lost your personnel. We've lost our internal operations. We've lost our financial resources in many cases. And then also a big change was that we've lost the ability to distribute. Now, of course, many of these capabilities have been recreated. The distribution capabilities have been recreated using online and e-commerce approaches, but those have really emerged quite strongly, but it took a number of months for many organizations to even try to get to those capabilities. So let me close my remarks and come back to my first question. So do you want to be a hero? If you want to be a hero to save your organization, to save other people from the misery and the suffering that they're experiencing now and the economic losses, then the challenge is for you to figure out how to create these capabilities in your supply chain so that you can have the capacity to get your supply, to move products, to communicate, to convert maintain your internal operations, to have your human resources available, to have the financial flows that are necessary, and then lastly, the ability to distribute. So let me close with that, and I'll hopefully have spurred some thought amongst the community, and also, again, let me close by saying thank you very much for the opportunity.
That's very interesting. We will figure out who wants to be a hero. Well, Mr. Janat Shah, would you like to be the director of the next hero movie as well and suggest to us what a hero should be doing, perhaps in India and around the world?
Thanks, Veera. And thank you, Dr. Rice, for that wonderful opening remarks. Before I come to my remarks, I want to thank Toby, Simon, and Synergia Foundation team for inviting me. And also, it's been a relationship which is a very long relationship. We work together. So thank you for inviting me. Actually, it's irony in some sense because Toby has been talking about pandemic for a long time. He's one of the few one he and Synergia Foundation has talked about that there's a likelihood of pandemic. Are we prepared? I guess none of us listen, probably, but I hope, now onwards, we'll take it more seriously. So, when we talk about this whole building resilient, supply chains, essentially, what does resiliency mean? Disruptions are going to happen, as Dr. Rice talked about. That's a part of life. Actually, I'm sure, our colleagues, the practitioner leaders, if they don't see a disruption once in a year, I'm sure they'll be worried. You don't know which disruption would happen, right? But I think the key challenge, as he talked about, Dr. Rice talked about, is, one, the resiliency means, are you able to bounce back? And what kind of impact this disruption had? Okay, and let me just illustrate with one very famous example, which all of us, anybody who has studied supply chain risk management, Dr. Rice is a leader in that, talks about that famous example, which happened almost 20 years back. where there was a fire in a Philips plant, and they were manufacturing semiconductors, and they were basically manufacturing chips for the mobile phone. And there were two major customers they were dealing with, Ericsson and Nokia. Obviously, both got affected. But the point was, the way Nokia responded was very different from the way Ericsson responded. The outcome was that Ericsson lost almost 400 million US dollars and lost a market share of about 27 to 30%. So I think this whole idea is, as Dr. Rice talked about, that how prepared you were for possibility of an event like this. Nobody could predict that actually fire would happen, right? All kinds of, if you look at a country like India, we're all used to, today, for example, in last week, we all were worried about Bombay floods. And I'm sure every organization in Bombay has been worried, how do you handle operations during this period? Because, we regularly see floods in Assam, we see regularly floods in Bihar, we've seen hurricanes, we've seen even, certain pandemic of a smaller nature in Kerala. The obviously issue with COVID-19 is it's very different in some of scale and scope and time frame. All others were relatively regional in nature. Here we talk about the entire globe getting affected, and it's been there for us for last 4 to 5 months, and we don't know how long it's going to go. So the question to ask ourselves is, one, obviously not on pandemics. Not all disruptions are alike. They differ in terms of scale, they differ in terms of time frame. How do we look at it? Second, why do we find the way we looked at Nokia and Ericsson, for a same business, different organizations in that same business get affected in a different way. Obviously, when we're dealing with COVID-19, we find some industries are going to be so badly affected, whether we talk about hospitality, travel, they're going to be so badly affected. Relatively, food is going to be less affected. But even here, we already see signs, For example, I'll just take 2 examples of a medium-scale companies. There's a company, Next Wealth, in Bangalore based. They work on, providing analytics and services to global firms. They made sure that they work in a smaller towns, but they made sure that before lockdown happened, the laptops and related, facilities were actually made available to respective homes. And with a result, they have been able to ensure very high quality of service, and actually they have got more customers during this period. I can understand, organizations like Deloitte and Accenture are very well prepared, but I'm saying even a medium scale organization like this, because they responded very fast. Similarly, I know organizations in a metering, which is already operating at 100% capacity utilization, while competitors are operating at 40 to 50%. So I think a couple of key questions is, one, is disruption, is risk management part of your agenda at a top management or not? And the organizations which have that behave in a very different way. So for example, just to draw, contrast, if I'm an organization where bulk of my supply comes from one organization in China, I don't know anybody in terms of tier 2 and tier 3, then I have the highest vulnerability. Vis-a-vis somebody else who has multiple suppliers, knows information at least about tier 2 and tier 3. So one is, first, at a design stage, what kind of vulnerabilities you have and are you aware of it? And second, whenever disruption happens, because as Dr. Rice said, you will never be able to prevent it, are you able to respond fast to it? So that will determine both in terms of the extent you will get affected and how fast you will rebound to it. I just raise 2 more points and then I would close my opening remark. So one of the key questions all of us will have to ask is that I want to prepare a resilient organization, but what kind of investment I need to make? Is this a trade-off I need to worry about? That if I build a resilient organization, supply chain, it's going to come at the huge cost efficiency. And I think there are creative ways of actually avoiding this trade-off. So rather than treating this as saying either resiliency or efficiency, there are ways in which we can build organizations which are resilient with some amount of efficiency loss, but not significant. So can I design it? And second, as I said, so when we talk about design element, Dr. Rice talked about the flexibility, the redundancy, it could be in terms of inventory, it could be in terms of capacity, it could be in terms of multiple sourcing, multiple suppliers, whole portfolio of toolkits which are available. How are you using it in an effective way? And now with new technologies like 3D printing and all, there are a lot of interesting possibilities that are available. So are you using more physical, sort of capacities, or are you using a lot more of knowledge and information, which will allow you to respond during that time period? And lastly, obviously during the disruption, this becomes our priority one. But will it remain a priority year from now, 2 years from now, or the way we have seen in past, that we seem to forget and get back into complacency mode? So do we make sure that our organization remain, this whole idea that we need to do this in a sustained way? So with that, let me stop here with my opening remarks, and I'm sure during the conversation, we'll come back to some of these issues.
Veera, we can't hear you.
Now, Udayant, can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So we've had the academics outline to us the real issues that are there. Those are core issues that one needs to address. But as a practitioner from the industry, how are you going to sort of balance between resilience, economic efficiency, and agility? Is it really a balance that needs to be made, and especially from an industry where you supply parts to the aerospace industry? How do you see the challenge ahead?
Okay, it's actually a very challenging moment, and both the professors have created a really nice foundation for this discussion. Our company, Dynamatic, is a mid-sized company with about 3,000 employees, of which a third are Europeans, Americans, Germans, Brits, and Americans, and 2/3 are Indians based in India. So we have a global mid-sized company, which is a manufacturer of highly engineered products. Now, in one of our products, we're the world's largest hydraulic gear pump maker, with 34% of the world's ag tractors using our products. So for risk mitigation and to have that sole supply dependency of the big OEMs on us, we had local manufacturing. So we manufacture in the United States and in the United Kingdom for the West, and we manufacture in India for Asia. So in a sense, that business was not really disrupted by the kind of disruptions of the lockdowns, etc., because India went into lockdown, our local facilities were matching with whatever was around us in terms of suppliers or customers. But when we look at the aerospace industry, one of the major drivers for our success was how we looked at the value chain in designing our business. Now, if you look at Western aircraft manufacturing, it's really in Europe and North America, and all the certified suppliers of basic raw material are also Western. As these people, and then they had tier ones who did major assemblies, you had tier twos who make the parts, you'd have small treatments and fasteners and stuff like that, which would be tier three. And then the raw material suppliers, as they globalize, they started trying to get tier 2 manufacturing to the East, low-cost countries. We actually designed our system the other way around, because when you machine, you take out 92% of the metal. And if you were to machine it in India, you wouldn't be really benefiting from the swarf that you generate. So we actually put our manufacturing of the tier 2. So we're a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 in a vertically integrated chain where we buy raw material directly from the mill, machine it in the United Kingdom with robots, with low cost of capital. We take out all that 92% of the swarf, we briquette it and give it back to the mill, so you get the best value of money, machine, and material. And then we did all the engineering work and the artisanal assembly in India, which is the opposite of what everybody did up till now. And that created a lot of new value. But in this COVID situation, it became a challenge because the whole global system was disrupted. So, to us, we're really driven by risk because we're a sole supplier to Airbus, sole supplier to Boeing, and a sole supplier to Bell Helicopter for major structures. And there's no second supplier. And these industries were declared as essential critical infrastructure in all the Western economies. So India went into shutdown or lockdown. We were very fortunate. We are located in southern India, in Bangalore and in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And these are really responsive states. So we can talk to the government, and within 5 days, they actually changed the law over here. And on the 1st of April, so 5 days after the lockdown, we were open and we were running. And in a sense, I think we were a little prescient about it, maybe because we're global, maybe because our antenna are up, because risk is such a major fear for us, because the obligation of being a sole supplier. We actually in the last week, we prepaid all our financial banking commitments till January next year. We just prepaid the next 4 quarters, actually the next 5 quarters. And we just said, something bad is going to happen. First week of February, we started training all our workforce for COVID. By the early part of March, we started testing all our employees. 100% of our employees have had swab testing, nucleic acid testing.
Right.
And indeed, we've conducted over 10,000 tests. It's the largest test program of any company in India. And we've been running our facilities. So I think what has happened is we've developed a very interesting model. We work with the Indian Institute of Science here in the protocols for testing. So it was even before ICMR had developed a system, we had something which we worked out between the state government and the Indian Institute of Science as a research screening program. And what we were also able to do as an intervention was pivot a part of our research into developing what is now the world's lowest cost ventilator. And we can produce, 25, 30,000 of these per month. These are low cost. They don't use electricity. They just get driven by an oxygen cylinder. And we sell them for $33 each. And it keeps you fully alive. It's something like you use when you're ascending a mountain or you're up in a fighter jet in one of the old aircraft with an oxygenator, with a regulator. So it's really interesting mill-derived technology that will save lives. And with that, I think I just like to say that the crisis is teaching us stuff every day. Our customers are happy. We haven't missed a heartbeat. Our banks, we didn't take any of the forbearance of what our Reserve Bank of India offered. In fact, we don't owe anybody anything. And I think we're running our business very safely with less than 1% of our people at any time out on COVID.
Right.
So that's what it is.
Thanks, Udayan. That was a specific company perspective. And before I get Mr. Jayaraman and Subramanian, I just have a quick question to both Mr. Shah and Mr. Rice, which I just want quick responses for. One of the key factors here is in a post-COVID world or after a particular event like this nature, Mr. Shah pointed out that as we go further away from an event, you tend to become more and more complacent. And when you're further away from the event on this side, when it's in the future, The threat is always theoretical. So for companies to reimagine their supply chains and reinvest in supply chains, there needs to be enormous amount of focus and involvement of economic resources. Given that, is there a formula to calculate how much is enough? Is there a basic two-step principle that companies can follow to say this much is the investments that we have to make, we cannot have anything less than that? Is there something of that nature? Mr. Rice and Shah, quickly.
Professor Shah, would you like to go first?
Well, so unfortunately, there is no formula, okay? And lot will depend on actually what Udyan talked about was a wonderful example. That what we saw was based on what the work they had done in the past, in terms of organizational capability. It was not, if they had woken up in March and said, now what do we do? I mean, honestly, the answer would have been that, the Airbus and Boeing would have given up on them, right? But I think it's a lot more in terms of organizational capability which you built. And that, it'll be good to ask him that question in terms of what are the investment. But I think it's more of the kind of organization which he has created. We talk about learning organization, which has kept looking at horizon, which is much longer. And that's why he's talking about not just satisfying his customer, but talking about, building these ventilators. I mean, it's amazing. I wish we had more organization like this. But Dr. Rice, you want to?
Thank you for your comments, Professor Shah. So Veera, that's a great question. It actually is working very closely towards the research that I'm working on right now. From our perspective, companies are using a number of different approaches, primarily an expected value calculation, which is a probability times the consequence. But because the probabilities are so small, and this is expected over a number of years that a probability of an event would occur, what you end up with is you have funding levels that are far smaller than what's necessary to create the capabilities that you need. Some organizations use scenario planning methods. Some use a portfolio approach. We are actually developing an options-based pricing approach, which changes the way we think about that. It's important to think about this, though, in the context of how you go about making these investments, and that would be thinking about it in the context of an S&OP process, and it's a process we're developing we call resilient S&OP. So those are my short comments. I could talk till the cows come home, though, about this topic.
Right. But interesting, there needs to be a start to come up with a mathematical formula, and MIT is always good at coming out with formulas and quantitative solutions to the problems. Let me just invite Mr. Jayaraman to make your first observation, sir, and perhaps pose a question.
Okay, hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Toby, for inviting me to this session. Professor Rice, it's a privilege to be here with you. Professor Shah, it's a privilege to be here with you. And my colleague from the industry, Mr. Subramaniam, glad to meet you here. And never to say my old friend, Toby. Good to see you again, Udyant, Toby. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. Look, from a Rolls-Royce perspective, we have three businesses. One is civil aerospace, the other one is defense, and the other one is power systems. So if you take the first two businesses, it's a long cycle business. So usually you should normally be able to tie to some of these kinds of pandemics or industrial, economic shakeups that happen. But this has been definitely a pandemic of unprecedented proportions. Nobody ever expected the world to shut down. So, there was no BCP that was going to handle this one for sure. And nobody ever expects travel to stop. And nobody expects all these aircrafts to just get grounded, sitting somewhere in Nevada or somewhere, elsewhere in India. I think every airport is filled with aircraft just sitting down. So I think, it's been something that for us, it shook our very foundation of what we thought BCP could be, to be honest. And I think I heard Mr. Subramaniam talk about it earlier. So we decided that we're going to formulate something which says that, look, we got to protect the present. We got to preserve the sort of the immediate short term, let's say the next year, 2-3 years. And then we got to look at what our long term is going to look like, and we got to position ourselves. So we took the 3P approach and say that for immediate protection, what we needed was cash. So we needed to make sure that we are grounded in terms of cash, in terms of our credit lines, in terms of positioning ourselves, so that we'll be able to protect ourselves and stay in the industry. But we also needed to make sure that our talent was protected, because there was definitely knee-jerk reactions of trying to get the cash, in the process of which we might let go of talent we don't want to. So we looked at the cash and the talent as immediate short-term, look at how we can do this. But we needed to preserve, which meant that once we've done the shoring up, we also needed to make sure that we're able to preserve them and continue to motivate them, continue to keep them grounded. And so that took us a little bit of time over the last 3 months that we've been working on saying, what does the next year or 2 years look like? But most importantly, what we needed to look at is the long term. What does our R&D look like? How do we be competitive? How do we position ourselves for the future? We had programs in there that we said we might have to postpone. We had programs in there we said we might have to shut down. And we had programs in there we said we got to do more. So I think we had to do that. So this is kind of a situation where, we are looking at the present with the protection, we're looking at the preservation, and we're looking at the position. So, but all these, what we found out as we are doing all this was, we needed to also look at governance. When it looked at governance, it was about health and safety of people. Do we open the factories? Do we open everything up immediately? Do we close everything down? Do we listen to governments? There was a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables that were thrown at us. And I think it became very important to us that, look, health and safety of our people, health and safety of everyone involved is very important. I think it was extremely important for us that the security, we needed to keep our technology secure, we needed to keep our people secure, we needed to keep our customers, the stakeholders secure. And I think eventually the culture, what culture will bring out of this? Is it going to be work from home culture? Is it going to be people coming into the office culture? So the culture was also evolving with people looking at how they're going to collaborate with each other and with all our stakeholders. So to be honest with you, I think the last 3 or 4 months has been something of a little bit of a wake-up call. And I think we have kind of sort of figured out a new normal that we are all working into. And the new normal has always looked at supply chain for us. And when we look at the supply chain, that definitely played a role in the new normal. And our supply chain in India has been 2 joint ventures. And we have had multiple suppliers in India. Because we are in the engine space, civil aerospace, it's a little bit harder for us to just get suppliers onboarded, because safety becomes very critical. There are FAA rules and regulations that, documentation. There's lots of things that go about in it, as you all understand. And so we have had always to look at balanced cost arbitrage with value arbitrage. And I think when we looked at cost arbitrage, it's easy to say that, okay, I got a cost advantage to come in. And I think Udyan mentioned it very well, right? I mean, you got to look at it and say, is automation required here, or are people required here? And then you look at it and say, do I need to do it in India? Do I need to do it in China? Do I need to do it in the UK or the US? Right. So I think all these things in supply chain, we have grown to about almost a commitment of $500 million plus. It has been really pulling teeth from a tiger. And the reason why it has been pulling teeth from a tiger has been the complications involved in the aerospace industry, but by the same token, the fact that we needed to get confidence with India, with the suppliers in India and everything, which companies like Dynamatics have paved the way for a lot of companies like Rolls-Royce to come and invest more in India. And I think today we formed a joint venture in Pune with Force Motors, so that we are going to be making a whole engine line, reciprocating engine line in India for the globe. And this pandemic, what it did was we were about 1 week away from start of production, and we had to shut it down because nobody could travel anywhere. And guess what? There are no revenues. Now the shareholders have to figure out how to put in more money into it. Now shareholders have their own problems with their own cash position. So how do we save all these things? So I think at the end of the day, yes, supply chain, has and will change for us. But I think the fundamental principles of why we did what we did with India will not change. And I think we are here to position ourselves more in India, because as we grow, we found out we had to go from capacities to capability. As we grow from capacities to capabilities, we had to grow from cost arbitrage and arbitrage. And I think that's been the story of Rolls-Royce in India. I will stop there, and I will.
Right, and I'm sure your joint venture partners would be happy to hear your commitment on that. Thank you so much. But I just picked up one question from what you were saying, and I just wanted to pose that to Mr. Rice and Mr. Shah as well, if you have insights, if you want to contribute into that a little bit, is how important is the culture of decentralization as we go forward? Is that the only insurance that you can create against threats that you don't know, a sense of decentralization, a sense of spontaneity in terms of decision making within corporate structures?
Thanks for the question. And thanks for your remarks, Mr. Jayaraman. It's very impressive, as well as Mr. Toby Malrothas. I think I have the honor of being together with some heroes here, so it's a pleasure. I think that your question, though, can mislead folks. Not your question doesn't mislead, but the idea of distributing the location of your facilities. Look, there's risk no matter what you do. If you consolidate your facilities in one particular region, you have the regional risk, all right? But if you spread those facilities out, you have increased costs, but you also have risks of having multiple organizations that you now have to manage. Mr. Jayaraman talked about the culture and the organization, and that now you're going to have to deal with that across two different organizations. So it's really a trade-off. Ultimately, there is more. There is some wisdom, I think, in distributing the risk across multiple facilities. But these are trade-offs, and it's not something that one could say you have to have one single operation or multiple operations or operations in every country. I've heard the design. Several of you talked about making the design decisions, and Mr. Jayaraman just talked about some of those trade-offs. The organization has to think about that. So we saw after the trade war started last year, there was a big rush of many organizations that tried to leave China and realized that, it's going to take 18 months at least in some organizations to build those capabilities. And even then, it's hard to build up the suppliers, the capable suppliers, particularly in the aircraft industry. So I think thinking about this from a design perspective is useful. It may lead to more regional supply chains, but there are risks with regional supply chains. It doesn't diminish those risks completely.
Right, interesting point. Mr. Shah, do you want to make a comment, or could I go across to Mr. Subramaniam first next?
Go ahead. Actually, I'll just take 1 minute. Basically, I think, we had an outstanding, as Dr. Rice talked about, outstanding case of the design, and to some extent, you also need organizational, reserve, right? Because the kind of issues, we talked about, we are seeing a lot of organizations actually just folding up because, the kind of complex trade-offs they are making, you need certain reserve capacity. Now, without that, we are seeing 25% startup actually disappear. Now, if you don't have those basic capacity and the reserve, you won't be able to do it. But I think we are seeing here outstanding examples of how people have used that reserve capacity in a very interesting way.
Right. Interesting. The conventional wisdom may suggest to some that spreading out the risk is equal, but as Dr. Rice points out, there's a flip side to that as well. Mr. Subramaniam?
Yeah.
Please go ahead, sir. Oh, I think his...
Okay. Very, very interesting.
So I think your internet supply chain is being disrupted at this stage. We cannot find... Well, I will try and get Mr. Subramanian back into the conversation, but just carrying on this conversation in terms of Udayant. Udayant, you're a young...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
Can you hear me now?
You go ahead. We can hear you. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Toby, for literally pulling me into this panel. I think it's been last few days, in fact, not just the last 1 hour or so, last few days has been a learning experience. We're trying to find out what this resilience we're talking about and relate to what we do inside the organization. So some terms are nice, but it's a great learning for me to preparing to come here. And I've been hearing Professor Rice and Mr. Shah and the industry colleague making a comment. So I think one simple sentence I will make, which is that when an aircraft engine comes out of Rolls-Royce, it doesn't go through a final stage in the manufacturing to say that now it will go through a process by which it will become reliable. I think by design and by parts and every single element and every single supplier and every single employee who's on it, the entire infrastructure and ecosystem which brought the engine is built to breathe reliability and quality, right? So I think the entire story on the risk management is, I'm trying to relate to what we are doing in DHL. We say that we should be the last going out of a geography and first to come back into the geography. Which basically means that you have a staying power and you have the resilience to come back into full operation. So I think the pandemic has given us the opportunity to demonstrate exactly that. Yeah, I think we hardly had a single day of downtime, and we put a simple banner theme for our organization to say that if our customers are operational, we should be operating and providing them service. And therefore, the basic work for us was to ensure that I match demand and supply, demand with supply, which is DHL capacity to serve. And we are a very large operation in the country and globally with 220 countries, close to 300 aeroplanes we fly internationally, and on any given day on air, I think the largest volume being carried is by DHL. So we are the largest cargo plane internationally on air. So, but then that operation can work only when it is built with reliability, because we promise customers 96, 97, 98% on delivery, on commitment in terms of transit time, which we commit to them. How does it get built? I think if I am looking through our process, I think we are paranoid about risk assessment. I think almost every quarter, every month, there is an assessment of some dimension or the other. Business continuity planning is sort of reviewed every now and then. And in India, there have been, the other thing is that there is so many things happening around you, and is your organization learning? I think Professor Shah made a comment about learning organization. I had written a point saying, learn from the disruptions. Because in the last 10 years, as an organization, we've seen one big fire, we've seen one mega flood, we've seen some 5-6 different floods, we've seen a few curfews due to terrorist attacks. Is your organization learning from it? I think I can relate to 10 things we've done in the last 10 years, which are each one of them is relating to an incident which taught you something. You know, when the Bombay floods came, 2 years after that, we split our customer service team into 2 locations. We had one in Mumbai. We set up a second team in Chennai, and we grew both of them, and today we are 50-50 between the two. So any one center goes down, the other one is kicking in. So how do you build your BCP into your design? How do you build capacity to resist disruption, and how can you be responsive? So therefore, when we are running a fleet, we are permanently asking, saying how much of it will be owned by us, how much of it will be available. What is the flex you are building? The flex is you are building because if your system gets disrupted, how do you bring alternate services into place so that your continuity is maintained? Similar is the case with all your IT systems. I think our business runs on information. For a long time, we used to have an uptime of our global systems at 99%. And this 2 years back, we asked a question saying 99 is not enough. Why can't our systems be 100% uptime? And then therefore we built so many redundancies and changed technology and invested so heavily. In January this year, we ticked the box saying we are now 99.978 or something like that. I think sometimes you do the right things, you get lucky, because that has helped us stand this COVID, because your redundancies in terms of your systems have been really fantastic. And therefore we were able to be the first mover in most places and never leave the market, and our capacities are running. So therefore, be the fleet we run, be the people we have, be the IT systems we have, be financing in terms of market credit, and how do you choose your customers and how do you choose your vendors. I think through and through in every process which drives the business, I think you need to you are asking for reliability, because that's what the delivery you need to make to the customer. Right. But built into reliability, I think, is also the risk mitigation which is there. Because if you have the right kind of portfolio of services built, which is building your business network, it will inbuilt have the resilience needed. The third area which has helped DHL Express in this pandemic, I can say, is that we are a globally network company, and therefore we have to run standard processes. There is huge emphasis on standardization. Process discipline is drilled into the way we work. And the way I work in Mumbai or Chennai or New York or London or Japan or Hong Kong, it has to be 99.9% identical. The terminology, the systems we use, the processes we make, the checkpoints we generate, how we treat our shipment. Because in our network, in a given country, we do only half work. I'm either picking up a shipment or delivering a shipment. The other half of the work is done by the rest of the network. Our hands have to shake every day, maybe 200 times. And therefore, that whole amount of standardization and discipline which is built into the organization makes the organization resilient. Yeah, and therefore, one of the biggest inputs and one of the biggest strengths of an organization to survive a pandemic like this is the culture you built into the organization. Yeah, the culture brings in the control, the discipline, the communication, the ability to withstand. And behind me on the soft screen, I have, it says best companies to work for. How you build your people. Yeah, how do you treat your people? I think in the last 6 months, we've not laid off a single employee. Everybody has been paid full. In fact, in April, in the middle of pandemic, we gave all of them their annual increments.
Right.
In June end, globally, there are about 500,000 employees in the group.
Right.
Every employee got equivalent of 25,000 rupees as an ex gratia for outstanding work because the company made record profits in Q2.
Right.
So therefore, the people are taken care of, people are skilled, people are trained, and they respond. So to be able to manage a pandemic like this and to build resilience in your network, I think every single element in your organization have to be built, and it's hard long-term work. It won't be invented by mere investment of capital. Yeah, there was a comment, and which is very interesting because DHL says that there are 3 bottom lines which are absolutely essential for the business, and put it in a triangle, which is your people, your customers, and your stakeholders or your business. Yeah, the pandemic really brought the dilemma on the table, right? In April, when everything is shut down and you're trying to find your ways to come back, what do you do with your people? How do you respond to your customer? And how do you ensure that your business is afloat? If business is not in good shape, you will not have the financial wherewithal to take care of your people or your customers. So you are permanently tossed around with managing and striking the balance between these 3 important bottom lines. Yeah. But I think your people are good, you find a way, your customers, the way you serve them, the way you live up to your commitment, they stay with you, and the business comes back. And like I said, the theme is if my customer is operating, I should be operational, which is what we've chased. And I think we've been successful, which is one of the reasons why by June we were running at full capacity. And in July, I think we are ahead of what we would have done in a normal July. Not true only in India, but globally. So I think it's an amazing experience last 5-6 months.
So you're saying resilience is the way to success, showing us what your practical experience of it has been through the COVID. But let me move to the last action hero in this panel discussion, which is Toby Simon, Synergia Foundation's in-house expert on supply chains. Toby, do you have thoughts or questions that you'd like to throw across to further the discussion? Toby, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Veera?
Yeah, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
So first of all, I want to thank Professor Rice, Professor Janet Shah, Udain Malhotra, Kishore, and Subbu for coming and joining us in this panel. I'd like to make 3 points quickly. 2 of them have been taught by Professor Rice, who runs one of the finest institutes in the world for supply chain, undoubtedly, and I've had the honor to spend about 5 years with him. And the first is I will introduce the concept of, it's an oxymoron, predictable surprises. It's something which Jim has been writing about since 2005. And I love this because, at the heart of risk management is this idea of understanding that there is something called predictable surprise. The second was something Professor Shah introduced me to, that how do you convert supply chain risk from being a bottom line to a top line, where you use supply chains and you see that you can make more money. And I was saying this is what organizations should do and not consider supply chain as a cost. And let me provide the context to it. For example, if I were to work with a company and the discussion centered around balance sheet, okay, and the company has reserves, surpluses, all that, it's fine. But to me, it's a historical document. It's not something which is, I would be more interested to know about the resilience document of the company. How safe is it for me to deal with this company? Because if something goes wrong with that company, I will also suffer. So these are the three things that I have learned from Rice and Shah in these many years of my interaction. And I think we are also privileged to have them today because they are two of the finest minds, along with our industry experts who have shared some brilliant insight.
Right. Thanks so much, Toby. I think taking forward from the question that you were saying, making a resilience document or a resilience report of companies, I just want to put across to Mr. Rice and to Mr. Shah, how much is underinvestment in resilience or the fact that it's going to go on, it will go on, we will somehow get over it, an underinvestment attitude in resilience to blame for the economic losses one feels at this stage. And is there a sort of a yardstick or a scale by which you can measure different industries or different sectors on the basis of their underinvestment in resilience and perhaps suggest them to boost their investments in that area?
Let's see here. So I think that it's this is a very difficult challenge, and I think that it is easy for us to be critical of organizations for not investing enough in resilience, because it's very difficult to make the financial case for making an investment in resilience. In fact, an effective investment in resilience results in nothing happening, and therefore it's very difficult to show an ROI when nothing happens. So you have to take a very different approach to it. So I think I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at resilience investments across industries to determine which ones are more progressive than others. I can say that there are some organizations that recognize the importance of that and allow that to play a larger role. And in fact, it's the organizations where the supply chain and the business continuity community are part and parcel of the leadership and the management. And it goes back to my comments earlier about what operational organizations, the process of S&OP, or what's commonly called now integrated business planning. This brings the marketing, the finance, the operations, the sales community together to make collective decisions about trade-offs that the organizations will make. This is the environment where the resilience decisions really need to be made. And yet most of the time, the investment decisions are done independent of that operational engagement, independent of the capital budgeting, or sort of integrating all three of those communities, capital budgeting, operations, and the supply chain folks, or I should say the S&OP. And so that's not to be critical of companies. It's just the tradition has been more to optimize a particular silo, if you will. And so I think there are different ways, and that's one of the things that we're working on that can help organizations think differently about how to make those investments. What you end up with is a boom and bust process. It's when there's a disruption, people spend money like there's no tomorrow. And after the disruption, companies will, wipe their brow and say, wow, we got past that one. We don't have to worry about that for another couple of years. And so, but we need a different approach. And that's what I think that we're working on right now.
Right. Mr. Shah, quick question, just taking off from what Mr. Rice has said, what has been the fundamental learning in terms of supply chains that COVID has brought about? The one key thing that you think everyone must be aware of and do henceforth after this pandemic in terms of building more resilience into their supply chains?
So I think obviously one is you have to survive, right? As colleagues talked about it. But is there a way you can come out stronger at the end of it? So as Dr. Rice talked about, if you're not careful, you're going to make a lot of wasteful investment because, you got carried away. So somewhere, how are you going to balance this? And also there's a question, for example, somebody like the Subramaniam, at the end of it, would your customer be willing to pay for it? Finally saying that I've made all this investment, but during normal time, my customer would come back and say, why should I pay for all this reliability, which I don't value? So I think somewhere, how do you even make sure your customer understands this? That, during normal time, you don't probably benefit from it, but during those difficult times, disruption times, you'll get more out of this than what you would have paid. This whole, the balance. So I think this is a very important issue, that how do you do this right, and how do you make sure your customers and stakeholders value it.
Fair
Right.
comment.
Thanks.
I want to make one line here to Mr. Shah's comment, which is
Yeah,
that
please go ahead.
I think the large number of customers, you need to show them the value so that they will take the price. Yeah, if they don't understand the value, they will not take the price. And then if you operate in a situation where you don't show the right value and the customer doesn't understand the price, both of you will come down when there is a crisis like that.
Right.
Yeah, so therefore it's important for you to build the right systems. It's a huge dependency with each other.
And it may also be one that is dependent on industry, whether you can share the price or not. If it is something that is of a continuous supply thing where the customer would be affected by a supply chain disruption, he may be willing to pay more. He or she may be willing to pay more. Wouldn't that be right, Mr. Shah?
No, but I think even Kishore talked about it. How do you make sure you play a value game, right?
Yeah.
He kept talking about that. From a cost, you move to value. So as long as you play a value game, you'll be able to show to this. Toby kept talking about it. This has to be finally value game.
Right.
So if you're able to do that, then you will be able to, everybody will benefit. Others will pay, the cost game, and will come down to lowest common denominator. Everybody would be worse off.
Yeah.
Right. Quickly, Udayant Malhotra, I just want to get your thoughts very quickly on this. Do you believe that post-COVID, the fundamental change is that you might see people, like for instance, there are several economists who are advising to governments that, look, this is not the time to look at fiscal deficit GDP ratio at this time. This is the time to spend to reboot the economy. Would the industry also adopt a similar approach where you say, look, this is not the time to look at cost margins, but this is the time to really invest in supply chains? Do you think we are there as yet across the board? Quick.
I think companies all have constraints, which a lot of governments with their federal reserves, the reserve banks, their ability to expand money supply and the tools that governments have, I don't think we can compare. But I think by design, you can design certain interventions. I think there were some really astute comments made by both Professors Rice and Shah about redundancy and the cost of redundancy, and how some of these may not be paid for in normal times. I'll just give you a very quick example. We were criticized in the past for keep trying to have 50% of our aerospace production in defense and 50% civilian. And we actually had a 56% and a 44%, almost half and half. Right now, it's really helping us because as commercial sales have really gone down, defense production has gone up, and we are almost at like 95% of normal production. I think companies need to, more than open the taps like government, they need to actually, as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. You have to be prepared for all eventualities. Thank you.
That's risk mitigation right there. Balancing between your private and the public, your customers. Wonderful. Well done.
Thank you.
Can't hear you, Vera.
No. We can't hear you.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. So one quick final question. You have given him the certificate of being the hero, and I think you've got 3 heroes. You started 4 heroes here. I count myself out because I've not done anything with supply chains. But Mr. Rice, a quick question to you. Where do you see in the post-COVID world, do you believe that supply chains will become more resilient? Companies will take this, given the scale of the pandemic was unseen before, and the kind of disruption that it created was not something that they have gone through before. And number 2, what does this do to international trade and businesses in terms of spreading your supply chain to other countries, the cost effectiveness which was driving your investment in other places. Quick responses to what do you believe will be the lasting changes from this pandemic?
I expect there will be an increase in resilience, but it will not be a huge step change. It's been increasing since 9/11 and 2001. So it's a slow change. It's an evolution. This will probably accelerate somewhat, but it's going to take time. For the aforementioned reasons, it's difficult to make these investments outside of the time when you have a disruption. Price pressures, cost pressures will make that very challenging. I do think that there's going to be a shift towards a more risk-balanced supply chain for organizations, and that was being pushed not just by COVID, but also by the trade wars that started last year and had continued last year, but certainly accelerated.
Right, interesting. Professor Shah, quick question.
Yeah,
Does that mean...
I would say, actually we're in the midst of some major changes even before pre-COVID. The two were one, which he talked about, Dr. Rice talked about, is geopolitics, which has to have major impact. And second was the digital. We were in the midst of a major digital revolution. And what probably COVID would do has a trigger to accelerate on both fronts. So we're going to see a very fascinating world where, already all these forces were there and COVID has acted as a big trigger. So we're going to see a lot more acceleration on that.
Right. My second question was that, in terms of manufacturing economies like India, you've always had this competition with India versus China because of China's cost effectiveness. Do you believe that cost effectiveness is going to play a lesser role in business decisions at this stage, and it's going to shift more towards more resilient, reliable manufacturing sectors?
I'll take first and then I think the resilience would mean lesser dependence on China. So I think that part is, it's going to, so countries like India has a great opportunity, but we will have to put our act together. Right. Essentially, nobody's going to come to us because they're saying China has a problem. Right. There are enough competitors around. Right. I think India has a great opportunity, but we will have to put our act together and say we are a great, place to help you in being more resilient.
Right.
But that's a lot of it is we'll have to do it. Over to you, Dr. Rice.
Right. Thank you so much. I just want to get a quick word from Mr. Jayaraman before we close the show because we've not gone back to him. Mr. Jayaraman, what is your prediction on the one lasting change that's going to happen to supply chains post-COVID?
Well, I think a lot has been said on this particular topic, but I would say I think companies are going to be looking at the BCPs very differently because they will, like Professor Rice said right in the beginning and like what Professor Shah was mentioning right now, I think it's not going to be a single-pronged approach of saying that, look, if I protect myself with customers, it's going to be okay, or if I protect myself with my employees, it's going to be okay. I think companies have to look at it and say, if another pandemic or if another challenge were to come up, how would I survive it? How would I stay through that particular challenge? Right. And so that thought process is going to be the lasting change that will happen. The thinking will change. Right. That's what I think.
So keep the black swan, keep predicting a black swan event and learn to work your supply chains around that. Unfortunately, what we're running short of is supply of time at the moment. We're 10 minutes over time. And I think the lesson we've learned is, of course, you can have two Tobis on a show to ensure enough supply of material, which is Toby Udayant Malhotra as well as Toby Simon. Thank you so much, all of you, Professor Jim Rice, Janat Shah, Udayant Malhotra, Mr. Subramanian, and Mr. Kishore Jayaraman, for joining us on this conversation. Hopefully, we'll make a more resilient post-COVID world in terms of business and supply chains.
Thank you.